I'm co-editor of Camera UK, and welcome to today's webinar. Now, the primary purpose of BBC News, according to Director General Tim Davie, is the pursuit of truth with no agenda. Now, that purpose, to deliver news that is fair, balanced, impartial, and above all, accurate, is codified in law in the BBC's Royal Charter. What Danny Cohen's report demonstrates is how often the corporation falls short of this ideal when it comes to reporting on Israel. Meticulously researched and sourced, the report provides example after example of lax journalistic standards and institutional bias against Israel, with a real-world impact on the safety of Jewish people in the UK and across the world, particularly in the context of rising anti-Semitism since the October 7th massacre. Consistently, their reporting shows facts being grossly misrepresented or ignored. Honest mistakes, of course, can happen in any field, especially one where quick judgments are needed in response to incomplete information. However, I think as Cohen's report persuasively concludes, the BBC is not merely careless in its reporting of the war in Gaza. The mistakes are almost always in the anti-Israel direction. It literally would not be possible to compile a similar record of any anti-Palestinian errors. Now, whenever the corporation is faced with the choice of whose account or narrative to believe, it seldom points in Israel's direction. For Hamas in this war, proof is rarely necessary. For the IDF, by comparison, and Israel, proof is almost never enough. Now, false and damaging claims about Israel's conduct of this war remain on the BBC's website long after they've been comprehensively debunked. The damage done by this misleading broadcast and social media output is unaffected by the occasional brief correction issued weeks or even months later. Meanwhile, there almost never seems to be quite enough space or time to sufficiently record or discuss developments that are favorable to Israel. Military analysts and experts across the world will tell you that Hamas cannot win the war it started with Israel by force of arms alone. That anti-Israel propaganda isn't merely a tactic for Hamas, it is in fact integral to its war effort. Indeed, it is a war aim in and of itself. You see, Hamas must convince the world through media outlets like the BBC that Israel is brutal, indiscriminate, and unjust. That the deaths of innocent Palestinian civilians are something that Israel wantonly pursues, rather than a tragic consequence of Hamas turning the Palestinian people into human shields. Hamas has embedded its terrorist infrastructure amongst civilians, including in former school buildings, which are often mistakenly described by BBC as working schools, as well as in hospitals and mosques. With an iniquitous disregard for the truth, Hamas even lays the false charge of genocide against Israel in response to the attacks on October 7th, which I remind you is the worst anti-Semitic atrocity since the Holocaust, and was indisputably a genocidal act against the Jews. Through these tactics, they seem to claim that Israel is actually fighting a war of aggression rather than taking the necessary defensive action in an existential fight against Iran and its terrorist proxies. Danny Cohen's report demonstrates that the BBC all too often accepts Hamas's distortion as fair framing or fact. And worse than that, it then sells them on the incredulous world as news burnished by the BBC's authority and reputation. And when the BBC is presented with a complaint about its coverage, standard operating procedure seems to deny, deflect, and then finally begrudgingly accept what they will assure the world is an isolated mistake. This report, however, catalogs that many of these isolated mistakes in one place for the first time. Now, irrespective of one's views on the conflict, any fair-minded reader will conclude that the BBC has serious questions to answer and real problems to address if it's to live up to its mission. Now, whether the BBC chooses to engage substantively on the content and recommendations of Danny Cohen's report will be a litmus test for their commitment to change. And unless they change, public confidence and trust in the impartiality of their reporting in this area will only deteriorate. Now, I'm going to read some examples from Danny Cohen's report just to give you a sense of the problem, as I'm sure many of you watching already know. Some of them are worse than others. On the day of the 7th of October massacre, while the rest of Britain's media were detailing the indescribable brutality of Hamas's attack on Israel and Israeli civilians, the BBC decided to lead its coverage with a headline about Israeli revenge attacks. That's right. While the massacre was still in progress, while Israeli civilians throughout the south of the country were being brutally killed, oftentimes tortured, raped, and mutilated, BBC decided that Israeli revenge attacks was the leading story. Another example, the BBC still refuses to consistently call Hamas terrorists because it would be seen as quote unquote taking sides, despite the fact that Hamas is a proscribed terrorist group per the UK government. Another example, the BBC falsely reported in October that an Israeli strike killed hundreds at the Al Ahli hospital last year, when in fact it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that landed next to the hospital. That misreporting reinforced entirely false claims that directly caused violence in some European and Middle Eastern countries, and in fact resulted in the burning down of a synagogue in Tunisia. Another example, the BBC published an article that wrongly claimed a UN report had warned that half of Gaza's population is starving. Again, that's content that's still on their website. Another example, the BBC took no action against 5 BBC Arabic reporters placed under investigation for highly offensive social media posts in the wake of October 7th, including explicit examples of anti-Semitism, as well as justifications for Hamas's massacre. These reporters are still working for BBC Arabic. Continue with BBC Arabic. They platformed one guest who had previously referred to the October 7th massacre as a quote-unquote heroic military miracle. Continue with BBC Arabic. They were forced to purge articles from its website, including one that asked whether or not the Kfar Aza kibbutz atrocities actually happened. That's right. It was a conspiracy theory that turned into content at BBC Arabic. Further, the BBC routinely quoted figures produced by the Hamas Health Ministry without highlighting that the ministry was a terrorist-run organization, and routinely fails to stress in reporting that Hamas fatality figures are unverifiable and include thousands of Hamas terrorists. The BBC repeatedly reported Israeli strikes on Hamas command centers based inside school buildings as quote-unquote strikes on schools, not strikes on command centers that were placed illegally inside schools, but as strikes on schools. And they also repeatedly failed to explain the terror group's use of innocent Palestinians as human shields. The BBC also came under fire for calling Palestinian militants and activists killed in the conflict as journalists. In fact, one BBC Arabic article described 69 journalists killed in the conflict, while evidence from their social media posts suggests that 55 of the 69 either supported Hamas or actually worked for the terror group. Those are not journalists by any objective standard. Further, the BBC failed to apologize for wrongly claiming the International Court of Justice had ruled that allegations Israel had committed genocide were plausible. Now, these are just some of the remarkable and shocking examples you'll see if you read the report. And we really encourage you to do so. And in fact, if you go on to our website at camerauk.org, you'll see quite a few of them. So let me start with a little bit of brief bio, and I apologize, I'm having some technical problems here. Okay, here we go. Okay, and I want to also remind everybody that you can start typing in questions in the Q&A section, and you'll see that below on the bottom of your screen. Okay, now Danny Cohen went to the Jewish primary school in Rosh Pina in Edgware, attended Oxford University, where he was awarded a double first in English literature. Danny started working in the television industry. Now, after working in documentary production, Danny spent many years running television channels, including BBC 3 and then BBC 1, where he was the youngest person to ever run the channel. Danny was then appointed director of BBC Television, where he had responsibility for all of the BBC's network channels and television production. Now, Danny is president of Access Entertainment, where he's focused on delivering world-class entertainment and financing fast-growing businesses. He invests in a wide range of entertainment, including films, television, live theater, the creator economy, as well as the visual arts and gaming. Now, since October 7th, Danny has written regularly for the Daily Telegraph, warning of the threat of rising anti-Semitism in the UK. He's also used his voice to urge the good people of this country, the silent majority, to speak out loudly on behalf of British Jews, and has called on UK institutions, including the government, the BBC, the police, courts, universities, schools, to show zero tolerance for racism against the Jewish community. We're going to begin with some of the questions for you, Danny, and then we're going to pivot to a few questions from our audience. And I think I want to start with this.
Good evening.
Now, the BBC matters greatly to British audiences as the nation's dominant broadcaster that everyone pays for through the license fee. Now, how important do you think BBC is for the rest of the world in terms of its impact?
Well, undoubtedly, you're right. Its largest impact is in the UK, but I think the BBC is a trusted brand around the world. It's a trusted brand in a world in which there are a shrinking number of trusted news organizations, actually a shrinking number of places overall where you feel you can come to get facts and unvarnished truth. So I think it's hugely actually important globally, because there are so few places you are meant to be able to get unbiased news, and the BBC has a long-term historic reputation for providing that.
Okay, and a question that comes up a lot to me, at least prior to this webinar, is what inspired you personally to speak up?
Yeah, so I left the BBC in 2016, and I had always been very careful prior to October the 7th actually not to criticise the BBC at all, because when you work there in a senior management position, you know how much incoming fire there is. And it was actually one of the things that was a little bit frustrating when you're there, when you saw ex-BBC people who understood that it was difficult digging in and criticising. But October the 7th changed that for me. The BBC's immediate response to October the 7th, you know, as you were saying earlier from our report, was very poor, very upsetting, very inaccurate, even whilst the attacks were going on. And I wrote a column for the Daily Telegraph, which was published, I think I wrote it on the Sunday, October the 8th, and they published it on the Monday, October the 9th, and they put it on the front page, which was about the BBC not calling the Hamas terrorists, and how wrong that was. And I think that triggered that as an issue in the UK. You know, later that week, the cabinet, members of the cabinet spoke about it. The Prime Minister spoke out about it. It was picked up quite widely. I'm sure on my part, it wasn't an original thought. There were lots of people feeling the same, but I think that got into the public domain. So from that point on, we then saw so many accumulating and difficult and dangerous problems with the BBC's coverage of the war, that I felt that I should keep speaking out.
Okay. Now, for those who haven't had the opportunity to read the report, can you just briefly outline what it consists of?
I think you've done a good job of that, Adam. I don't know how much. I mean, you gave a lot of examples. You read some sections from the foreword to the report, which, as you say, people can read on the camera site. So you can see from that if I was to talk quite generally, I would say that it describes dozens, actually becoming hundreds, of examples of BBC bias, factual misrepresentation, and crucially bias of admission. And I'll come back to that in a sec, in the BBC's reporting of the war. And alongside the examples is a series of recommendations for how they can change. Now, the reason for doing it is because what the report aims to show is that this isn't a mistake here and there, a one-off mistake. This is a systemic, repeated, consistent problem. And the report provides an opportunity and an information source to show exactly that. This isn't one-off. This is happening consistently in a range of very excuse me, egregious ways. So that's what the report intends to do, and then tries to be practical and productive and suggest recommendations. The one point I just come back to there is that point about bias of omission, and this is really crucial because often bias is not what you say in the way you report the news; it's what you leave out. And time and again, and actually night after night and day after day, the BBC's reporting the conflict suffers from that bias of omission. It suffers from decisions by editors and journalists to leave out crucial details, such as Hamas are terrorists, such as Hamas are, building their tunnels under schools and hospitals and UN facilities. Such as the reality of Hamas intimidating its own population, or the fact that Hezbollah on the northern border has been sending over thousands of rockets over the last 12 months, and before that, of course. So there's different kinds of bias that the report gets at, but they cover, as I say, factual misrepresentation, bias of omission. The other one, which is really interesting, which I think is worth mentioning, we may want to come back to, is who do you use as your sources? So if your sources for your information are not unbiased, you will be then transferring to the audiences, BBC audiences, biased information that can't be relied on. And often that information is not clearly labelled as information that may be biased. And that's a really significant problem too.
Okay, well, I mean, as you know, of course, I mean, Camera UK and Camera Arabic, of course, contributed a lot to this report. And mentioning the failure to acknowledge the background or biases of contributors and sources is an issue that our Camera UK department, my colleague Hadar Sela, is constantly reporting about the BBC, that they might use a really, really biased and in some cases radical NGO and fail to provide listeners or readers or viewers with any background at all in which to contextualize the information that they're getting from the source. And that leads me to another question that I think, we've been doing this, monitoring the BBC consistently for about 12 years now. And I mean, looking back over the years, I don't know how closely you follow BBC's coverage of Israel back the years, but would you agree that the problems predated October 7th?
First of all, I want to acknowledge and thank Camera for all the work you're doing in this area. And my report could not have been as detailed as it is without the input of Camera. So I really want to acknowledge that on this seminar. And
thank you.
For the people that support you, it's really important that you know that Camera played a very important role in it. I think there has been problems over time prior to October, 7th October. I think there are certain reporters who are clearly and consistently problematic over time. There have been incidents. There was one relating to, it's become known as the Hanukkah bus incident, which took place 2 or 3 years ago, where a group of Jewish school children on a visit to central London at Hanukkah were the victims of anti-Semitic abuse, and the BBC misrepresented what happened, and it took many, many months for the BBC to back down and acknowledge they got it wrong. So there've been incidents and there've been individuals. I think what the events since October 7th have shown is that there is a very deep systemic problem, that it's not just an issue of a handful of reporters, it's not just an issue of one editor, it's not just an issue of an incident, that what other people have been concerned about in the past, and it's probably why Camera have been tracking this for many years, that there is a deep and systemic problem in the BBC, and the volume of reporting on this conflict has brought that into the light. By the way, the volume of reporting in itself is an interesting issue, because one of the things you could ask yourself is why, with so many other things going in the world, does the BBC spend so much time reporting this conflict? It spends very little time, for example, reporting on the horrendous events taking place in Sudan at the moment, terrible famine there, armed conflict, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives at risk. Gets very little coverage on the BBC. But there has been wall-to-wall coverage over the last 12 months of Israel's fight against, Iran and its proxies. So another area of this is actually its volume of content and whether that is disproportionate to world events.
Thanks. Now, of course, your report has a separate chapter focusing on BBC Arabic. Do you have any thoughts on the impact of BBC Arabic's bias on BBC English content?
Yeah, so a really significant part of this is BBC Arabic, and it's something that Camera's been, very hot on for, I think, for a long time. There's the number of this isn't the amount of mistakes they've made; these are the amount they've agreed to correct on BBC Arabic. So it's in the hundreds now, and that shows it's systemic. Now, the reason that matters particularly is because BBC Arabic, their reporting, their sources, their stories are flowing into the London news gathering, BBC London news gathering, and providing the basis for a lot of the BBC's UK and global reporting of the conflict. So if you get a dodgy BBC Arabic report, of which there are daily examples, and it's based on unreliable sources, then that is flowing directly into the English language services of the BBC. And that's a particular problem. They don't acknowledge, they don't recognize when the source is a Hamas member, whether they've got, they're a member of Islamic Jihad, whether they're people that have celebrated the massacre of 7th of October. All of these things are not clear in BBC Arabic's reporting, and then flow through into the national, international English language reporting of the BBC. Now, it's inherent and it's an obligation of those people in London and around the world in the English language services to check the sources themselves or ask questions. That's not happening either. So what you're getting there is a very dangerous relationship between the two, where the inaccurate, biased, dodgily sourced reporting of BBC Arabic is not just a problem in the region, but it's a problem around the world because of the way it's being used. And it's a problem that the people in London who run news gathering and decide which stories are used are using this material from BBC Arabic so regularly.
Okay. Now, one of the things you mentioned, individual journalists within BBC being more problematic than others. And, it's been our experience whenever there is a conflict that erupts between either Israel and Hamas or Israel and Hezbollah, the BBC brings back to the region reporters with, let's just say, really problematic records, such as John Donison, Barbara Plett-Usher, Orla Gurin. So I guess, my question is, and maybe you don't have a good answer, but we've really wanted to know, why doesn't the BBC understand that a reporter who has already breached editorial guidelines by, for instance, to cite one of the journalists I mentioned, literally crying at Yasser Arafat's funeral, that would be Plett, or tweeting a photo from Syria passed off as being from Gaza, that would be John Donison, does not enhance its claim to provide trusted news. That is, do they not learn from their mistakes, or is there some institutional reason why even the most problematic reporters who have clearly shown their bias are brought back time and time again?
One of the problems with the BBC in this is their unwillingness to acknowledge in anything like anything more than superficial sense the level of problems they have. So the BBC will go as far as to acknowledge a mistake is made and will sometimes apologize for it. What they consistently resist is the notion that there's something deeper going on. So because the reason for that is that it's reputationally damaging to them. Now, forget for a moment the fact that, well, it may be reputationally damaging to them, but you're causing huge damage to one of the minority community and helping to generate anti-Semitism. That's putting that aside for a moment. The BBC's allergic to acknowledging reputational fault and hyper defensive against reputational damage. So were they to take steps against some of those journalists, they would be at the same time acknowledging that these problems exist in a deeper way, and these journalists are a problem. I also think there's a bit of I can't, this is my assumption, I can't prove this because I'm not I wasn't in the newsroom, I'm not a news person, I'm from the other part of the BBC. I was responsible for the channels and drama, comedy, entertainment, and so on. But I think there's a balance. There seems to me a balance of power in some of these relationships, imbalance of power. So, and it's something I'd like, I want to address more with the BBC, is do editors say there's 6 or 10 o'clock news here in the UK, the main evening news broadcast? Do the editors of those programs feel able to stand up to Jeremy Bowen and really push back? Because some of his reporting, the tone of his reporting, so clearly has bias dripping from it, that you would think that if the BBC was maintaining its standards, there would be significant challenge to the way those reports are presented and what's missing from those reports. And that seems to rarely happen. So I think there's a number of things going on there. There's a desire to a strong desire to avoid reputational damage by acknowledging that there are significant and systemic problems. And I think there are probably also likely imbalances of power in the newsroom in terms of standing up to some of these journalists whose track records on Israel, I think, are pretty clear now.
Such as Jeremy Bowen, for instance.
Yeah. He's a prime example. Yeah.
Do you think also, I mean, a lot of this stems from, this is something that people ask me, I monitor the non-BBC British media, and I often talk about the problem of echo chambers, whereas people within news institutions rarely hear a view that doesn't already affirm their preconceived bias. Do you think the problem of an echo chamber is a big problem within BBC News?
I think there's a lot of echo chamber. I think that I think there's also the structural thing that we're also seeing in universities and other places, particularly with younger journalists, that there is a structural bias against Israel based on a kind of colonialist oppressor versus oppressed structure. And I think that's playing out as well. So like with all of these complex things, there's a number of different things going on at the same time. I think there's probably a left of centre bias in the journalist community, which is true of nearly all of journalism, or a very large part of it. It's not, that's not unique to the BBC. So I think all of those things are playing out at once. And I think you've got some people, as we were saying, in very senior reporting positions who I believe have clearly got a position on Israel, and that feeds through into how they report.
It's interesting. In the U.S., I think it's safe to say that, America's history of racial issues, of racism, of slavery, often colors their framing of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, imputing race into a conflict that, is not about race at all. And so would you say that similarly that the British news media organizations, particularly the BBC, impute this colonial paradigm because that's kind of in the ether?
Yeah, I mean, it feels even more pronounced, doesn't it, in the context of Israel since the 7th of October. I think a lot of people, it's a problem we face. A lot of people feel it. A lot of people believe it. From my perspective, a troubling amount of young Jewish people are starting to believe it. Or are being informed by it, or being told about it, and and their friends berate them about it, whatever else. So I think there's a very big structural issue here that gives me great concern.
Okay. Now, a question that we get probably more than any other question, when I say we, I mean me as a camera at Camera UK, to what degree, if any, do you think anti-Semitism plays a part in the bias reporting about Israel and the bias reporting about anti-Semitism in the UK?
Central to it. I mean, well, it depends how, if you accept the internationally approved definition of anti-Semitism, which includes reference to treating Israel differently to how other nations would be treated, and that kind of toxic crossover between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, I think they're very closely aligned, and I don't see how you can't feel that in that reporting. Very hard to prove in any kind of like an empirical way, but I think if part of the definition of anti-Semitism is that you're treating Israel differently from other nations, then I think that goes for a lot of the reporting.
All right. Another thing that, in having monitored the British media for 14 years for me now, I found it really fascinating that your report was actually, there's so much division within any national Jewish community, and yet when your report was published, there was a statement of endorsement from the Chief Rabbi Mirvis. There was a similar endorsement from the leading community Jewish organizations. So, I don't know that there's a perfect algorithm for this, but why do you think that this? What do you think caused this? What I would argue an unprecedented show of unity amongst British Jewish organizations that reminds me a little bit of the unity during the Jeremy Corbyn years, but I think in some ways this is even more of a unified front within the British Jewish community. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, you're right, Adam. Very, very rare for all of the main Jewish community organizations and the chief rabbi to support something like this. The last time was probably during the Corbyn years, but as you say, I think this was again slightly different. And I've been very grateful for their support. I think it tells you one very clear thing. They genuinely feel, as I lay out the foreword to the report, and as I've been doing in my columns in the Daily Telegraph, they genuinely feel that the bias reporting the BBC is contributing to an atmosphere in the UK in which Jewish people feel less safe. They feel that, and that comes from, CST is the organization that protects Jewish people in this country, does an incredible job. So that's why they did it. It was not to help me, not to support me. It was because they take what is going on with the BBC and its impact and its consequences very seriously. And they believe that because of that, it was something they wanted to jointly speak out on.
Okay. All right. So, the report that you edited includes some recommendations. One of the recommendations that we've been highlighting and pushing for since, I guess, for the past 12 years has been to have a truly independent complaint system, rather than the BBC grading its own homework. Now, in addition to that, I guess, what are the recommendations that you feel are the most important that you would like to see implemented?
Yeah, so you'll see the report divided into three sections. The first comes under restoring trust, and that the recommendations in that section include things like an independent inquiry into the coverage of the war and the subsequent war with Hezbollah, work on the recruitment policy of BBC Arabic, consistency in the way Hamas and Hezbollah are described as proscribed terrorist organizations, a number of different areas like that, regular meetings with Jewish community organizations, so on. And as you say, there's a reference in that section to a truly independent complaint system, which the BBC categorically doesn't have. There's then a section on online. Of course, so many people and so many of us get our news online at the moment. So there are things in that around proactively checking, a recommendation to proactively check the social media accounts of BBC journalists and BBC programmes, more careful rules around social media usage by BBC employees. So there's recommendations like that. And then there's section on third parties, because obviously news is based on, and reporting is based on sources. So your news is only as good as the quality of and veracity and independence of your sources. So there's a section on third parties and being transparent with audiences, whether the witnesses and the people who've contributed information have terrorist connections, whether they and where the information has come from, basically. So there's three kind of sections: restoring trust, online, and third parties and third party sources, and the recommendations are bundled up into those three categories.
Yeah. What can you tell listeners or those viewing about the BBC response to your report so far?
So that's one thing it's harder for me to talk about, because I have begun a dialogue with them, and we've agreed, in order for it to be as productive as possible, we'll keep what we've discussed confidential.
Okay. All right. Now, what would you say to critics who accuse you of being anti-BBC?
First of all, they can say what they want. Don't really care. Don't look at social media, so they probably don't know they say it.
Very smart.
I think I'd probably argue the opposite. I think I'd say that the BBC is incredibly important. That as we started this conversation, reliable sources of trustworthy news has never been more important, and the BBC must remain at the heart of that project. But if it loses its reputation for accurate journalism, accurate, responsible journalism, then the BBC's the loser and all of us are losers, not just license fee payers in the UK, but everyone around the world. So I earnestly believe what I'm saying is pro-BBC, and the BBC, in order to survive and flourish and maintain those values, it needs to get its house in order on this.
Okay. Let me ask you, it just, occurred to me, you're in the entertainment industry, and have you found any, I don't know, have you had a price to pay economically or in terms of your business for having spoken out so publicly about the BBC?
Well, you don't know what you don't know, so you don't know what you're not being offered. But I work for a wonderful man called Selena Blavatnik, who's a great supporter of Israel, a Soviet refusenik Jew. And so he's very supportive. He's doing a lot to support Israel and British Jews and Jews around America, Jews around the world. So I don't feel it in terms of where I work, and I'm grateful for that. Are we not being offered some projects that we might do? I don't know, but I'm not rushing around looking for projects. We have plenty of work, so I'm not really too worried about it. I will say, however, that there is no doubt that the Israeli industry is suffering. That it's much harder to get Israeli work, television work, out into the world at the moment. That I believe it's the same for Israeli writers and authors. And so, like many Israel-based industries, it's got very significant international problems at the moment.
Okay. Now we have a long queue of Q&A questions from our audience, but I do want to ask you, maybe this is more about me than you, but do you have any plans on challenging bias in other British media outlets, like, say, Sky News?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, Adam. I mean, there's no doubt that Sky News has got very, very serious problems of its own, and again, partly comes back to lead reporters, because these are the people you hear every night, and there's one or two reporters on Sky who are just awful in terms of bias. The reason I haven't is not because it's not there, but because I think the impact of the BBC is an entirely different order of scale.
Right.
Both actually in the UK and globally. And the reality of Sky is it reaches a few thousand people every minute, 100,000 a day. And doesn't, and you can sometimes get it abroad, but it's not really watched by the people. The impact of the BBC is on such a colossally different scale that in terms of where to put your energy, it's the right place.
Yep, that seems reasonable. Let's switch now to questions from those that are watching. All right, so this is a question from Aaron. He says, the question is that the Palestinians say BBC is bent towards Israel. Now, have you come across arguments that, the problem is the other way around?
Yeah, I have, and some of them have come from the BBC. I think I'd say two things on that. First, maybe three things. First, a wise person I worked with at the BBC in a very senior role once said to me, it's not the number of complaints, it's the quality of them that matters, and that's what we should take seriously. The second is we're a much smaller community than, say, the Muslim community. So, it's like, 3 million or so to 250,000. So if we're getting roughly the same amount of complaints, you should learn from that. The final thing is, it just doesn't matter. It's what's the reality. And if you ask the other side in that debate to provide the volume of evidence that I provide to the BBC, I don't think they'd be able to. So when you actually weigh the evidence in its specifics, I don't think it's in the same place.
Okay. I have a question from Lawrence Julius. He says, Danny, thank you for the excellent report, which alongside the Atchison report exposes the bias at the BBC. How can the reports be leveraged to change the BBC? Should there be a judicial review?
So there's not going to be a moment. There's not going to be like a big bang moment where suddenly everything is okay. It's just, the world's not like that. The BBC's not like that. There's never going to be a point where they put their hands up and say, you're right. Um, there is a systemic issue. We are going to do all of these things because, frankly, it will be too reputationally damaging and too embarrassing. This is even if they acknowledge it, and I'm not sure many people in there won't accept it. Partly also because it's reputationally damaging to them as individuals. If you accept that there's a problem of systemic bias in an organisation that you've been overseeing, the implication of that is you're not doing your job properly either as a manager. So there's a personal issue of reputation to this as well. So there's not going to be a big bang moment that happens. I think what's much more likely, and maybe we're seeing in some ways already, there's going to be incremental change. There's going to be wins here. There's going to be problems there. There won't be a point where there are no problems. But what we have to keep trying to work towards is there being significantly less problems. So
Right.
that's really what I target and what people in the similar area to me target. And that's a realistic goal.
Okay. Ian Ashley would like to know, are there grounds for reporting the BBC to the Metropolitan Police for inciting racial hatred against the British Jewish community?
I don't know if any work's been done on that. I would be surprised if it meets a kind of legal threshold for that, but I'm not a lawyer.
Okay. Okay, this is Dr. S. Gold. I no longer trust the BBC and I no longer want to support it through the license fee. The BBC should have to fend for itself in the competitive world of the news production and broadcasting. But if I cancel my license, I lay myself open to prosecution. How can we challenge this stranglehold?
Yeah, I think that's upsetting for a lot of people in the Jewish community at the moment. They don't want to pay for this service that they feel so let down by and angry about. Listen, I can't encourage people to break the law.
Right.
But I understand why more and more people are feeling that.
Okay. And let me just ask you a question. Let me get off to my own question. Has the new government, made an impact on the likelihood of institutional change insofar as the parliament, putting pressure on the BBC to reform?
No, is the long and the short answer. We have a Labour government now. Have they been sound and balanced in Israel so far? Not sure. So I wouldn't expect much support there at the moment, no.
Okay. I want to get back to also me as one of the questions I wanted to ask before when we were talking about motivations and anti-Semitism. It's said that we live in a kind of post-truth world where news organizations kind of even reject that you can discover something called truth. It's been described as epistemological relativism. Do you think that the BBC is infected with this kind of both sides? As long as we show both sides, we show Hamas, and then we also show Israel's side, that we've kind of clicked our box and that they've abandoned the search for truth, which is at the heart of the journalistic endeavor?
I think they definitely suffer from that kind of both sidesism. They've had that problem before, actually, around reporting of climate change. Where the need to show balance to both sides actually meant that they were straying from reporting scientifically accurately. And there were problems about that in the past. So yes, I do think there is a problem with both sidism. But I think, from everything we've said, that's only one element of the problem.
Okay. Dr. Colin Lessey, I'd like to know, is this not a failure of the chairman of the BBC governors and the board of governors who have failed to control the BBC, or is it more the director general, Tim Davies?
So the primary responsibility sits with Director General Tim Davie and the head of news, Deborah Turnis. And the board of the BBC have some powers, but their powers are limited. And editorial responsibility absolutely sits within the executive. We're reporting up to Tim Davie, and Deborah Turnis, as the head of news, reports to him in this context. So that's where the responsibility lies, primarily. And the board have some oversight role, but the change has to come from the executive.
Okay. Manly Perkle says, how can one stop reporters from editorializing while they are reporting news? On the weekend, one reporter reporting from Lebanon, reporting on IDF actions, referred to the IDF as the Israel so-called defense forces. Any thoughts
Oh,
on that?
what else are they? It's a real problem. Was that on the BBC or somewhere else? I don't know if you said that, Adam, but it's a real problem, and I don't know why they feel so strongly they need to do it. Certainly, they should do it on the BBC. The BBC should be about reporting facts, not giving your personal opinions. So that, to me, I don't know. Oz is a very clear example of bias because the tone drips with skepticism about Israel. In that case, for no reason. So yeah, that's a good example, a good detailed example in my mind of bias.
Okay, that's good. Now, a lot of people also ask us, and I'm trying to like encapsulize this. We get various parts of this question over the past 12 years, and that is, I mean, do you think that, for instance, the BBC, what broadcasts in dozens of languages, right? I think some 40 or something like that. Has there been any effort to monitor or to get a sense of how the reporting in, say, Persian or other languages that might be very problematic given the political situation there? Like any sense of, other than Arabic and English, how BBC is reporting elsewhere?
Not to my knowledge, no. I mean, we know a fair amount about BBC Arabic now, partly through our collaboration with Camera and the work that we've been involved with in identifying bias and misreporting on BBC Arabic. But I'm not really across anything across the other services, BBC Persian and so
on. Okay. Let's returning to anti-Semitism for a second. Now, the CST, publishes periodic reports. Since October 7th, the increase of anti-Semitic incidents in the UK have skyrocketed, and they've gone dramatically. Now, a lot of what we argue in our posts at Camera UK and at Camera Arabic is that, and this is true of The Guardian, I think of Sky News, of many other media outlets, that, and I think this is true if you look at polls of the British Jewish community, they think that anti-Israel bias fuels anti-Semitism in Britain. Now, do you think, I mean, I guess, would you agree that consistent bias against Israel, even if there's not an anti-Semitic trope within the report, that fuels anti-Semitism in the UK?
I think it does. Yeah, I think it does. Now, all of the responsibility on that doesn't lie with the BBC. Anti-Semites need to be held responsible for their anti-Semitism.
Right.
And if they are choosing to take information like that and carry out anti-Semitic acts of any kind, then they're responsible for those acts, and everyone should be really clear about that. But I think it feeds into an atmosphere which emboldens those people and which gives them the material that they might be seeking to clamp down on Jews and do negative things around Jews. Listen, we saw it in a number of horrible and ongoing ways. When the posters started going up at the hostages, there were people in Britain ripping down posters of hot kidnapped babies. Just horrible acts. Now, is that an anti-Israel act or an anti-Semitic act? To me, it's both. I think many people might say that. So where the line between what is anti-Israel and what is anti-Semitism is, it's hard to imagine that you'd rip down a picture of a kidnapped baby just because you don't like Israel in itself. I don't know, maybe you would, but it seems to me that the two have such a strong and toxic crossover that it's often one and the same.
Okay. There were reports maybe a month ago, maybe longer than a month ago, of Jewish BBC employees complaining about bias within the BBC and anti-Semitism within the BBC. Now, even leaving aside their coverage, do you think that there's a problem of institutional bias within the BBC, within the newsroom, within the hierarchy, where Jewish employees don't feel safe, don't feel like they're being treated the same as their non-Jewish employees? Any sense of that from your experience?
Yeah, there is. I mean, a number of them, quite a lot of them have talked to me, privately and off the record on confidentiality about that. a number of them feel that, yeah. Quite a number have contacted me personally about the discomfort they feel. Sometimes they feel isolated. Sometimes they're aware of choices that news editors are making, which reveal bias in the way the reports are being put together. So yeah, that's definitely been going on, no doubt about it. And quite a few have come to me directly with that.
Thanks. Dina Littman wants to know, what can we do to help? She said she's made complaints to BBC and Ofsted and received no response. I think she means Ofcom. What can people out there who read our content, read your report, but they want to be part of the solution? What can people do?
So you may not feel it, but complaining does matter. You know, the volume of complaints, the specificity of complaints, it really does matter. So I would definitely keep complaining. One other practical thing that can be done at the moment on this issue of calling terrorists, which shouldn't be as hard as it seems, and calling terrorist acts, there's actually there's a consultation being done with the public at the moment on that. And it's part of an overall review of the BBC editorial guidelines. And one of the parts of that review of editorial guidelines that's gone out to the public is seeking feedback from license fee payers on this use of terrorist or not in the context of these kinds of matters. So that's another example of the way in which you can contribute. Please do contribute to that public consultation the BBC doing, and make your views clear on that use of terrorists and terrorist acts.
Okay, thanks. Sharon
tell your
Cohen
MP, by the way, tell your MP, you know, whether your MP is going to listen or not, you know, put pressure on the people who can put pressure. So if you've got an MP you think might be sympathetic and he might stand up and ask a question in the House of Commons or in a House of Lords committee or anything else, all of these things matter, because I think pressure coming from lots of different places over a long period of time has benefit.
Okay, so the short answer is keep on complaining, contact your MP.
Yeah, and contact your MP and do what you can to raise awareness, really. Do what you can to raise awareness of it amongst your friends and peers.
Okay. Sharon Cohen wants to know, can you speak about whether reporters are influenced by official or unofficial editorial guidance or cultural norms within the organization? Are reporters actively instructed or pressured in some non-explicit way to adopt certain narratives? And how often does copy get revised in ways that might amplify perceived biases? So I guess the question really is, you think there's pressure from, say, they hire a journalist that has no particular bias and wants to report accurately. You think there's pressure to kind of follow the crowd within the BBC?
I think there are cultural norms. I think some of them, as we were saying earlier, is around that structural interpretation of what Israel is and how the conflict's played out since the founding of Israel in 48. So I think there's a number of things around that. I think there are individual journalists in positions of influence, power, and exposure who dictate to some extent the tone of the coverage. And I think there's a laziness, I'm afraid, as well, in terms of that bias of omission and an unwillingness to present the other side of the story. I don't think there's someone at the top of the news organization saying, be anti-Israel. But what I do think is there are people at the senior end of news who are not sufficiently dealing with the problem they have with their staff of anti-Israel bias.
Okay. Also, one of the things that I've argued, and again, my monitoring is non-BBC, but that it seems like very often a journalist will come in and start reporting accurately, and then slowly but surely the reporting will slide into the consistent narrative of the news organization. So, I mean, I certainly have found that at The Guardian, at Sky News, it almost doesn't matter who replaces the Jerusalem correspondent, that you can expect the same framing no matter who's there. So in my experience, at least with non-BBC outlets, I think it's been institutional. Now, I want to get back to Arabic because, as you know, Camera has a very strong and effective Arabic department. And, as someone who doesn't speak Arabic. I am in contact with our Arabic staff, and I just am shocked by the levels of support for October 7th, the outright anti-Semitic comments on social media that my guess is would have been flagged, or more likely to have been flagged, if the reporter was reporting in the English division. Do you know anything about the institutional issues within BBC Arabic, or like, does it surprise you at all that there's these two standards, one for English and one for Arabic, in terms of what the institution accepts and what kind of vetting they do or don't do with their reporters?
I don't really, is the honest answer. I really only started thinking about BBC Arabic since 7th of October, and I don't know enough about its institutional thing. What I would say, and this, for me, the really important part of this is that is then, as I said, feeding through into the mainstream English language broadcasting. Let me give you one particularly heinous example of that. There's a BBC Arabic reporter called Sally Nabil who supported tweets on 7th of October that celebrated the massacre. She showed support for a tweet, for example, that called it a morning of hope. Now, you would think that someone who'd done that would no longer work for the BBC, given its standards. There may have been some disciplinary process. I don't honestly know, because the BBC won't tell you. But regardless of where there was, she's still employed by the BBC. Well, worse than that, a few weeks ago, she was actually on air in the UK on BBC One, the main network, reporting on the conflict with Hezbollah. So you have a situation there where someone who has shown terrorist sympathies is not only continues to work for the BBC, but is deemed acceptable by someone to continue to report on the conflict with Israel, despite what is evident bias. And I think that shows both how bad the problems are at the BBC at the moment, how difficult this has become for Jewish people, and also this dangerous interaction between BBC Arabic and the English language services of the BBC.
Okay. Let me ask you, I don't know how far your institutional memory of BBC reporting goes, but I was struck. I was reading a book by Yehuda Avner called The Prime Ministers. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to read that. But he was an advisor to 4 prime ministers, and he was talking about his role advising Menachem Begin. And Begin was quoted several times talking about how he kind of like perfected his English by listening to the BBC News, and he described the BBC News. This was in the late 70s and early 80s as fair, balanced. Like you knew you were getting the straight news from the BBC back then. So my question is, like, do you have a sense that of when BBC News coverage of Israel began to change? Like, do you remember a time when it was more fair? Has it gotten worse? And if so, do you have any sense of when that happened?
I don't really. I don't think, generally speaking, I was paying enough attention to that specific question through that period. I don't really. I think you guys would have a better view on that because you've been studying it much longer.
Okay. But certainly you found that it's gotten worse over the past 10 years. Is that safe to say? Like, say, since Operation Cast Lead, since
I think so. I mean, I think it has, but I don't have as much empirical evidence of that. But I think anecdotally that does seem to be the case. Yes, but I can't show that empirically in the way that the report shows.
Right. Also, are you in touch? Are you close with Trevor Asserton? Have you talked about your individual
I
results?
talked to Trevor, yeah. I wouldn't, I don't know whether he described me as close. I don't know if I would, but yeah, we've been in touch and I gave him some advice on his report. Yeah.
Okay. All right, great. All right. Well, I want to really thank you for setting the time to speak to us. And we get, more complaints about the BBC on our Camera UK website than any other media outlet. It's the topic of conversation in our comment threads. We get emails and tweets, and so this is something that we've been wanting to do for a while. So I really want to thank you, Danny, for taking the opportunity and for editing a really important report, which I want to remind people watching is available on our website. It's the featured article at our site. So Danny, again, thanks again.
Yeah, pleasure. And as I said, thanks again to Camera for their work in this area. And for the help in providing some of the examples in the report in terms of the BBC's reporting. Thanks very much for everyone for joining.
Thanks. And just one final note, those of you who are interested in getting involved with our work, keeping the BBC accountable, go to our website, camera.uk.org. There's also a donate button at the top that you can contribute to our important work, which, as you're, I'm sure, not surprised, has the amount of work, the amount of content that we've had to keep track with since October 7th has grown exponentially. So we rely on our supporters, their donations, and your support to get us through this really difficult time. Also follow us on X now, X/Twitter. We're on Instagram. We're on Facebook. And I want to thank everyone who took your time out of your day or your night to watch. Thank you very much and have a good day.